Now, if poverty really is a human rights problem, as you've suggested, why aren't human rights part of that conversation? And maybe let me just tag on, you know, where do you think this shift in Amnesty's work, where is that going to take Amnesty International? How do you imagine that the future of the organization now?
Well, it's interesting that this definition of poverty, more broadly than just in terms of economics, is not new. It's been around for a while. In fact, my compatriot Amartya Sen promoted that idea of development as freedom and freedom as development. And yet, many poverty eradication strategies, poverty eradication programs don't recognize the rights basis of it. And that's for a number of reasons. One is that there are still far too many governments that believe authoritarianism is the way towards development. China being a model of that if you sacrifice, if you suppress liberty, then it makes development easier. I cover that in my book, and I argue that there is nothing to show that China's economic development has anything to do with China's suppression of human rights. There's no link between suppressing civil liberties and the promotion of prosperity. Then there are others who believe that economic and social rights are not really rights, and therefore don't want to take a rights approach to development. I mean, in this country, you have a big debate about healthcare and whether healthcare is a right. And then there are those who believe that the market will take care of it all. If we have economic growth, one day we will overcome poverty. But what economic growth does, yes, it does pull some people out of poverty, but it also leaves behind others. And we must constantly ask who's being left behind, because those who are being left behind are usually the most vulnerable, the most discriminated, the most oppressed. And economic growth also creates inequality. And in the last decade, the more prosperity we've seen, the more inequality we've seen as well. So for all these reasons, even though there is some realization that a human rights approach may solve the solution, there isn't the political will. So we see a huge gap between what the data and the analysis and the research and the voices of poor people are telling us and what actually happens in practice.
Thanks very much.
Now, you asked me about Amnesty and what this will mean for Amnesty. Well, I think Amnesty has always stood with the forgotten prisoner. Amnesty threw light on prisoners of conscience in the early 60s, and through the years, we have picked up other so-called unpopular issues, such as the abolition of the death penalty, at a time when even international law did not recognize that issue well. And today, I think Amnesty must again stand with the forgotten prisoners. Today's prisoners are not behind prison bars. That's the difference. And that's why Amnesty has to throw light on the situation of women who die giving birth. 500,000 women die giving birth or for pregnancy-related reasons. A woman a minute a day, as you saw in that. One woman dies every minute, according to that film. And very often that happens because of discrimination, discriminatory access to healthcare, because of low status of women, because women's lives are not valued. More women die of maternal reasons than people are tortured in the world today. So how can Amnesty remain silent in the face of such travesty? There are people living in slums who live in the middle of large cities, who help to build the economy of those cities, and yet don't have a right to live safely in that city. You saw in the film Kibera, the largest slum in Africa. 1 million people live in that slum. And when I visited the slum, I could see water pipes running through that slum to supply local neighborhoods, rich neighborhoods. But the people in that slum could not have clean water. They're pushed off by unscrupulous landlords. So those are today's forgotten prisoners. And Amnesty today has to pick up their cases and fight for their freedom, empower them to gain their freedom, just as we once fought for prisoners of conscience and just as we continue to fight for prisoners of conscience.
Thanks very much. Maybe we turn the perspective to the work of Amnesty in the United States. Larry Cox is the executive director of Amnesty International USA. He began working with Amnesty in 1976, working on the death penalty, which Irene mentioned, and many international missions. In 1990, he became the director of the Rainforest Foundation, working with indigenous peoples of the Brazilian Amazon, something that I know is close to the heart of many people here. In 2006, Larry returned to Amnesty, and we're delighted that you're here with us this evening. Could you tell us, here in the United States, there seems to have been a disconnect between supporting human rights overseas, where the United States sees itself as a leader in human rights, countries like China, Burma. On the other hand, the United States is not as good at reducing poverty, not as good in terms of international aid and international commitments. And as Irene mentioned, here in the United States, there's now a disconnect between justice and human rights, and the healthcare debate is a good example. Well, how might you explain that in terms of the history, and where do you think Amnesty's contribution can be in that field?
Well, it's not because the idea of economic and social rights is foreign to the United States. In many ways, that idea was developed here as it was in other places. Franklin Roosevelt, in his famous Four Freedoms speech, very early on recognized the link and called for both freedom from fear, but also freedom from want, and saw that the two went together. He, as President of the United States in 1944, he made a speech, a State of the Union speech, in which he called for an economic Bill of Rights in the United States, and said that those rights were implicit in our Constitution. And of course, when it came time out of the horrors of World War II, the deprivation and the indescribable acts of cruelty that were the Holocaust and the worldwide depression, out of that experience to create the Universal Declaration, Franklin Roosevelt's wife, who was chair of the commission that created the Universal Declaration, continued with those ideas and built into the Universal Declaration both civil and political rights, but also equally economic and social rights. So the idea really has American roots, and it's not because the American people have been against this idea. The polling that we have done and that others have done show that, in fact, today, if you go to the American people and say, what are human rights, they will, of course, talk about the right to be free from torture, the right to be free from being locked up in your beliefs, but they will also say the right to have decent health care, the right to have a good paying job, the right to have education for my children, by really sizable majorities the American people believe in. The real reason that there is this disconnect is because of what happened after the Universal Declaration was created, or even as it was being created. There was a fear in the United States that the rights that were being discussed in Paris would come back and be used to criticize the practices of the United States in 1948. We, of course, in 1948 had social and racial apartheid, a system of racial apartheid in the United States. We had massive numbers of people, largely but not only people of color, who were deprived of decent education, who didn't have jobs, who were being lynched. There were massive human rights violations. So there was a desire to sort of shield the United States from the implication of the words that were being proclaimed, and to create a kind of system in which human rights would be for export. We would use them to criticize other countries abroad, but we would not use them so much to look at our own situation. And we have paid a terrible price for that decision, which has been through many administrations, both Democratic and Republican, continued. We would not, had we made a commitment to the whole spectrum of human rights contained in the Universal Declaration, I don't think in 2009 we'd be sitting here having a debate whether 40 million Americans should actually have decent health care. We would not witness the scandal, the unnoticed scandal. We talk about the unheard truth. How about the scandal that nobody talks about, which is that our poverty rates have now reached an 11-year high again. We now have 47 million people living in poverty in the richest country on the face of the earth. None of that is conceivable if the United States had made a real commitment to honor what's best in its history. And what we're trying to do now, I think, is to bring back to the American people the fact that freedom from fear and freedom from want are absolutely inseparable, and that we ought to be committed and fighting for both.